He grabbed my sleeve like he owned whatever space I was breathing in and barked, "Ma'am, is this child yours?" And the world narrowed to that single question and the small body shivering against my hip. The girl mouthed, "Say yes, please," and I lied without thinking, pulling her into a hug and feeling her whole frame tremble like a wet rag. The guard, big, thick mustache, the kind of guy who looked like he'd been on the job since pagers were a thing, watched us with that slow, hard scrutiny and radioed someone in a voice that didn't leave room for argument. I kept rubbing the girl's back because what else do you do when a kid is shaking on you and the adult world has gone mean and loud? "Are you safe?" I asked when the guard turned his back for a second, my voice low because I didn't want the noise of the mall to swallow her answers. She shook her head so slightly I almost missed it, then told me in a whisper that split me open, "Someone took my mom." Her words came thin and sharp like glass. She told me the man had a fake uniform, the kind of lying uniform that tried too hard to look official. Her mom had worked the city for a while, she said, used to be an officer, slow, proud, afraid, and she knew the uniform wasn't right. The man had come up to them when they were looking at toys for a birthday, and when her mom pulled her into a fitting room, the yelling started somewhere nearby, and then the noise stopped and the door opened and her mom wasn't there. I steered her toward the food court because bodies and sound make it harder for predators to pick a single target. "You hungry?" I asked, because food quiets small panic like a trick, and she nodded so fast she almost knocked into my knee. We sat at a corner table under a neon sign and I bought a slice of greasy pizza and a lemonade that tasted of sugar and regret. She ate like she was stocking up for winter, one hand gripping the crust while the other kept finding mine like a lifeline. Between bites, she told me what happened with a clarity that steadied me more than I liked to admit. She described the man in detail because her mom had taught her how to look. Limp on the left, small crescent scar on the knuckle of his right hand, a cheap metal badge that didn't shine right. He had a partner, she said, chewing through the finished crust, a woman who stayed at the edge of the store. She smiled the wrong kind of smile. Her eyes flicked around the court like she expected them to appear on the other side of the glass. I kept scanning too, thinking of exits, thinking of cameras, thinking of all the awful ways grown men hide in plain sight. "Why didn't you run?" I asked, not wanting to sound like a cop but needing to know if she had a plan then. She tapped her temple with the thumbnail of her dirty little hand and said, "Mama told me to stay where she could find me. She said if anyone comes, look at their patches. If it's not right, don't go." She said it like she was repeating a school lesson, like it was a game they used to play in their kitchen. She told me about the dress room like you tell someone about a bad dream that had turned real. The curtains were thin, the light was buzzing, and they had been choosing a card for her aunt's birthday when the man came in and asked for help finding a child's safety seat. Her mother squinted at the badge and the jacket and said, "No, that's wrong, not real," and pulled her into the dressing room and told her to be very quiet. Then there was a crash like something heavy hitting metal, shouting cut off by a different voice, and when the curtain was pulled back, nothing. The girl kept replaying the moment the curtain lifted, the exact tilt of the lights, the shape where a person should have been. She'd written it inside her head and could recite it like a map. I asked her about the badge again and she mimed holding a little flat circle between thumb and finger. "It looked like a sheriff's star but crooked," she said. "Mama said it was fake because the points weren't even and there was glue on the back." I took pictures with my phone of her stretched out descriptions, any scrap of memory might help, and I asked her what else she remembered, smells, voices, anything. She said rubber and bleach, the smell of a place with big metal doors and a low hum like a refrigerator. My hands got cold thinking about how specific and useless those memories could be without a place to put them. The guard still hovered like an unhappy cloud, eyes sliding to us every few beats, and I kept my voice steady in front of the girl because she needed an anchor. "What's your name?" I asked. She whispered it like she was giving away a secret. "Lily." She said Lily like it belonged to a person who had once been allowed to trust the world. I kept talking because quiet lets monsters think, because talking builds a paper bridge to somewhere safer. "Okay, Lily," I said, "we're going to figure this out. We're going to find your mom." Saying it out loud felt like a promise I wasn't sure I could keep, but a promise sounded better than the hollow noise of panic. People around us moved like nothing was wrong, carts rolling, kids laughing, couples browsing, but nothing in the noise masked the way the blood rushed in my ears. I kept thinking of the man and his limp, and of the way the girl could tell the badge was wrong. I kept thinking of how fast things change. One second you're buying a present, the next someone is gone, and a little girl looks at you like you're the only adult left who can build a wall against the dark. I held her hand and watched the exits, and somewhere under the neon and the music I started dialing. She went rigid in my arms like someone had flipped a switch and whispered, "He's here." My breath stopped and the mall noise turned thin around that one small voice. She pointed with a chipped fingernail to a man by the sandwich counter in a blue jacket and said, "That one. He limps on his left. Look at his right shoe, it's scuffed." She said it like she had said it 1,000 times, like her mom had taught her to read people the way other kids read storybooks. My stomach dropped in a way I can't explain, a sudden emptiness that rolled under my ribs. I looked where she pointed and tried to act normal while my brain scrambled receipts and faces and the shape of the man. He was a thin shadow against the bright shop, one hand tucked under his jacket, shoulders hunched like he wanted to be invisible. I watched his gait and then the shoe and felt my chest go cold because the limp, the scuff, everything clicked in a place in my head where I didn't want anything to click. For a second I didn't speak. Lily, the girl, kept watching him like she could make him move by staring. I pulled my phone out with hands that were suddenly clumsy. My thumb hovered. I typed a text to my husband because it was the fastest way to get a baseline, and because in the back of my head I wanted someone I knew to explain why a man I'd seen 100 times looked right there in the middle of the mall, near a little girl who just lost her mom. "You around?" I sent, trying to keep it casual because I didn't want to set off alarms if there was a chance of mistake. The canned reply came back almost instantly, the one I'd been told to expect, at work dealing with inventory, 3 dots then gone. The message was small, like a normal day, but it landed like a stone. Panic and calculation rolled together in my head like two trains about to collide. Call the cops now and risk the fake cop and his partner bolting from the scene, possibly taking the mother somewhere else. Or try to get closer and gather more at the risk of getting noticed and making everything worse. I felt ridiculous trying to think like a detective when my hands were shaking, but my gut kept tallying exits, cameras, and the distance to the service corridors. Lily's thumb kept finding my sleeve like she needed the anchor. "Can you walk fast?" I asked her quietly, not wanting to make her shout or cry. She nodded so hard her ponytail bobbed. I told her to tuck her hand in my jacket and to stay quiet no matter what she saw. We moved through the crowd like a pair of old shoppers trying not to draw attention. I kept my eyes on the man in the blue jacket and the way he shifted, ready to sprint. He didn't notice us at first, and that small mercy made my mouth taste like metal. We slipped out a side door I didn't even know led to the back and into a maze of employee halls that smelled like bleach and burnt coffee. The lights buzzed, and the walls were plastered with posters about holiday hours and lost and found policies. I hurried and kept counting steps in my head like you count breaths in an emergency. Left, right, straight, door. The girl kept up, her little feet hitting the tile faster than I expected. She didn't complain, she just followed, eyes wide with a mix of terror and a strange, quiet trust. In the parking garage, the air hit us like a hand. Cars, engines, echoes, a different kind of public. I kept scanning, watching the rows, looking for the blue jacket, the limp. The girl pressed close and whispered, "He went out the front." Her voice was small, but the sentence changed the angle of everything. If he had left through the front, he might have seen us slip out the back. I swallowed and tried to steady the trembling in my fingers. "Okay," I said, "we're going to keep moving. We need to find her car." She pointed toward a row of gray and silver vehicles and led me like she'd been there before. Her knowledge felt like both a puzzle piece and evidence, and I kept thinking about cameras and receipts and the sound a shoe makes when someone is trying not to be noticed. I started the car with a key I hadn't meant to need that quickly and drove us toward the lot where she said her mom had parked, every light and turn a little louder in my head than it should have been. We found the car where she said it would be, a battered gray compact under a flickering lamp, paint chipped, back bumper held together with tape. I parked a few spaces over and watched the girl move like she knew the route by heart, the way she leaned into the rear wheel well and fished around until she pulled out a magnetic spare key like it was a trick she'd practiced 100 times. She handed it to me and my hands felt too big and clumsy for such a small, precise thing. "You sure about this?" I asked, because breaking into someone else's car felt wrong until I remembered her mother might be inside a metal box somewhere else, and wrong felt less important than action. She shrugged and mumbled, "Mama hides things." Her voice was flat like someone reading a list. I slid the key along the seam of the driver's door and the lock clicked open with a routine sound that sat wrong in my head, like opening a mystery novel to the last chapter. We moved slowly, me doing the big, careful motions so she could watch and know this was safe. The car smelled of stale air and old snacks, juice boxes tucked under the seats, a smell that made the girl's shoulders drop a fraction because it was familiar. I opened the glove box and saw a manila folder shoved in sideways, edges bent, and a small metal glint caught the light inside. She leaned forward so close her breath fogged the window and whispered, "There." Inside the folder was a sheriff's badge, the kind with a faded sunburst and an old pin that looked like it had been dropped 100 times. There were photocopied pages with notes and photos of missing people taped to the margins, and a gas receipt with a partial plate number scribbled on the back in a hurried hand. I took pictures because pictures don't forget in the way our heads do. "What is all this?" I asked, keeping my voice low, as if the car itself might overhear and snap shut like a trap. "My mom was trying to find people," Lily said, tapping the photocopied pages with a dirty nail. She thought someone was pretending to be a cop and taking folks. She kept files. She kept receipts. Her fingers trembled at the edges of the paper like she was touching something alive and dangerous at the same time. She told me her mother had turned it into a hobby at first, checking leads, driving to storage units, talking to people who knew people, and then it became something else entirely, a list of names that grew and didn't stop. She said they'd take people for money, she added, small and fierce at once. They'd tell you it was official, so you listen. My head started to map things out. The fake badge, the cheap jacket the girl described, the details about a limp and a scuffed shoe. I felt anger and a cold, efficient fear that made my hands move faster. I photographed the badge, the receipt, the files, every scrap of paper I could get a clear shot of because the images might be the only way to link a face to a place later. Lily watched me like I was trying to catch her mother's life in a jar. When my phone's camera clicked, she flinched like the sound meant the moment might be sealed and taken away. We locked the car back up and drove to the downtown precinct like two people carrying something too heavy for our pockets. The ride was quiet except for the hiss of heat and my own thoughts ricocheting. Exits, cameras, the way predators use the world like a map. At the station, a child victim specialist met us in a room that smelled like coffee and cleaner, a patient woman who had a way of making space and not pushing. She took Lily gently and led her to a quiet area with crayons and a coloring book, speaking slowly and asking nothing that would jar the child. I watched them walk away and felt both relief and a new kind of worry because once professionals took over, things might move faster than I could keep up with. Detective Marcus Hale introduced himself with a flat voice that meant business and nothing that screamed drama. He asked if I could sit down in a small interview room while he took notes. He wanted the details I'd collected: the badge, the files, the limp, the shoe scuff, the gas receipt with the partial plate. I told him everything I knew, laying it out like cards on a table. How Lily mouthed, "Say yes, please," to me when the guard questioned her. How she described the fake uniform and the partner who smiled at the edge of the store. How she remembered the sound of a curtain and the smell of rubber and bleach. I told him about the magnetic spare key and finding the folder in the glove box, and I handed over the photos on my phone. Hale listened without interrupting, scribbling details into a notebook that looked like it had seen 1,000 nights. When I finished, he leaned back and said, "This is good, this is specific." It wasn't comfort, but it wasn't dismissal either. He asked for names and dates and if I could stay reachable, and he explained carefully that a child victim specialist would keep Lily close while they started tracing the partial plate and checking storage units. He talked about warrants and camera pulls and how they'd handle the mall footage. I felt my chest unclench a bit because hearing procedure meant things could move, but it also made the danger feel technical and therefore very real. I left the small room with my phone lighter and my head heavier, and a new, stubborn hope that the papers in that glove box might be the rope that pulled a woman back from disappearance. The social worker kept talking like she could fill every silence with procedure and forms, pressing gently about foster placement and temporary guardianship, while I tried to hold the girl's tiny hand in my head. I answered as best I could, my voice steady enough to sound useful, because Lily needed someone who sounded like they knew what to do next. The specialist squeezed my shoulder and said they'd get a safe bed and make sure she had blankets and food, and I nodded because I wanted the child settled and not talking to me while the police worked. Detective Marcus Hale was the one I watched then, hunched over a screen with that flat look officers get when they start seeing a pattern. Hale pulled up mall footage and scrubbed through minutes like you flip through a photo album of small, important things. The images were grainy, the kind of video that makes faces a puzzle rather than a portrait, but there he was. A man in a blue jacket walking through the food court on the same afternoon the girl said her mother vanished. The time stamp matched the story, and the angle put him near the exit Lily had described. I felt my stomach drop because the footage made the story leap off the pages of the girl's memory and sit in front of me, quiet and undeniable. Hale froze the frame and pointed at the screen like it was a finger pointing to a truth that couldn't be argued with. At that exact moment my phone started to ring and the name on the screen made something inside me tilt. I answered because habit is loud and my fingers were already shaking. He asked where I was like he was checking up like I was an employee and he was the manager. "Where are you?" he said. His tone was casual at first, then knife-edge quick. I lied and told him I was at the store, my voice small and hoped for normal. He asked what I'd bought, who I was with, and then slid into questions that felt like measuring tape across the truth. "Are you with anyone? Who is that? What did you find?" His questions stacked like a list of control, probing for details and for leverage. I kept answering in fragments because I didn't want to say the words that would change everything faster than the police could move. When I tried to steer the conversation to something harmless, he insisted, voice low now, Tell me exactly where you are. Don't do anything stupid. There was no concern, only that same cold calculation I had seen before. I lied about being in a store because saying I was at the precinct would set off a whole different fight I couldn't take while Lily was in another room. My hands couldn't stop shaking and I wanted to put the phone down and run into the screening room to check on her, but I held on long enough to end the call without giving him the truth. After I hung up, I felt like I'd sealed a deal that bound me to a question I hadn't wanted to ask aloud. I took a breath and told Detective Hale what had just happened, watching his face for grief or surprise and finding a professional attention I'd come to rely on. I said quietly that I thought the man on the screen might be my husband. Hale's pen didn't miss a beat. He asked for names, dates of birth, places of work, vehicle descriptions, and whether my husband had any known law enforcement ties. I gave him everything I had. The truck he drove, the way he favored a left limp when he was tired from a past injury, the kind of cheap jacket he liked to wear when he wanted to blend in. He nodded and tapped at the keyboard like the station itself was a machine built to catch liars and lovers and thieves. Hale ordered more footage pulled from every camera in the mall and surrounding blocks and called the traffic unit to check plate reads for that time of day. I watched the screens refresh and felt like someone watching dominoes line up, each tiny image a possibility. Within an hour, the feeds came back with a cleaner story. My husband had been at the mall 3 days earlier, and again that same afternoon, the blue jacket visible in both timestamps. The surveillance showed him pausing at exits, lingering by blind spots, and shifting his weight like he was studying the architecture more than shopping. One feed caught his truck on an access road near the mall at odd hours, and another showed him watching a far corner where the fitting rooms opened toward the walkway. Hearing the evidence laid out like that, names, times, places, made the world go quiet inside my skull, as if a curtain had been pulled back and I was seeing the backstage of my life. Hale explained calmly what they would do next. Expand the camera pulls, check phone pings, and put a surveillance detail on any locations tied to the partial plate in the receipt. He told me to try not to talk to my husband, and that he'd have techs mirror my phone so they could see incoming messages. The order felt like a lifeline and like a trap at the same time. I left the room with my chest too tight for air, and my mind cataloging every small lie I had told to keep peace, wondering how many others had been woven without my noticing. They moved fast and clean, like a machine built to undo panic. They mirrored my phone so I couldn't get a surprise call, handed me a burner that felt alien in my palm, and booked me into a small safe hotel under a name I didn't recognize. Detective Hale said, "We need you out of reach for a while," and I did what he said because the alternative felt too dangerous. The hotel room was cheap and smelled like shampoo and lemon, but it had a lock and a thin curtain between me and the world. I sat on the bed with the burner in my hand and tried to breathe. Tex took my phone back to the station and set to work, explaining in jargon that made me feel both safe and stupid. "We mirrored everything," one of them said. "We can see calls, texts, and any new messages." It was invasive, but I didn't have the luxury to feel violated. They told me to use the burner for my own calls and to leave the main line for investigators. I felt like I was living two lives in two devices. The one that might get me into danger, and the one that could help catch people who made a living stealing mothers. They searched the house like you check a body for scars. Officers moved through rooms with rubber gloves and bright lights, lifting cushions and opening boxes. In our bedroom, they found a prepaid phone taped under a dresser board, the kind of cheap flip phone that disappears in a drawer and then becomes an alibi. The call logs on it were ugly and clear, numbers tied to storage facilities on the edge of town, times that matched the mall footage, and a pattern of calls late at night. Detective Hale held up the tiny phone and said nothing, because the evidence spoke loud enough. Financial investigators started to trace money like a bloodhound. They pulled bank statements and followed threads that led away from our joint account and into shadowy places. Deposits kept showing up from shell companies, business names that meant nothing, routing numbers that looped through other little businesses, payments that added up to tens of thousands of dollars over the last year. "People pay for records," one investigator told me. "They pay for dirt on people. They pay for the ability to move people without a name attached." Hearing the words made chunks of my life split open, the ordinary bills and grocery receipts suddenly stitching into a pattern I had never wanted to see. Meanwhile, Lily was in a world designed to be kinder than the one she had known. A child victim specialist kept her in therapy and pushed for a decent foster placement while we waited for the police to stitch together the rest of the map. I visited when they allowed it, carrying the stuffed bear I found in the car and a blanket that smelled like detergent and someone's old perfume. She clung to things as if safety could be a fabric you folded around yourself. Her foster family was quiet and practical and let her cry in small, safe bursts. The specialist said, She'll get better in small pieces, not all at once. And I nodded because it made sense even as my heart kept beating like a fist. As the months of digging went on, two names rose out of the mess like bad weather on a radar. One was my husband. The other was Sophia Green. Hale showed me photos pulled from cloud accounts and social media that were grainy but telling. A woman in her 30s with a crescent moon tattoo on her left wrist, the crescent a soft arc of ink that the detectives circled in yellow. They found her around storage units the same way they found everything else: receipts, camera footage, and a neighbor who remembered a white van with a dented bumper leaving at 3 a.m. A payroll trail led to one of the units where rents had been paid in cash, and the ledger names lined up like a cheap scavenger hunt. Detective Hale put it plainly: Sophia Green turns up in unit records tied to victims, and your husband shows up on camera and in traffic reads at those same zones. He didn't shout blame at me, he let the facts do the work. I felt hollow and furious in alternating waves, like being at sea without a life preserver. I wanted to scream, to ask why, to tear apart his things and find an explanation that wasn't betrayal. Instead, I gave Hale the keys I had and every scrap of memory I could think of. Nights he came home smelling like gas at odd hours, texts deleted too fast, the late cash deposits he blamed on work. They widened the net, checking coworkers' phone pings and storage unit logs. Each test felt like pushing on scabs. The more they pulled, the clearer the map. A network of people who used law enforcement costumes, fake badges, and the small kindness of uniformed authority to chip trust away until someone could be moved. The financial trail became the backbone of the case, turning the kidnapping stories into contracts and receipts. It made the crime something that could be proven in a court, not just a horror in a girl's head. At the safe hotel, I lay awake listening to the building hum and thought about the files in the glove compartment, the badge glued to paper, the little girl who had pulled a magnetic key from a wheel well like it was normal. I replayed the moment my phone rang and my husband's voice slid into me like oil. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't sure where my life ended and his began. Detective Hale called late and said they were moving on warrants and surveillance. I said nothing for a long time after I hung up, because words felt like tools you could both build and break with. I held the burner like a compass and hoped it pointed the right way. He ran when he realized the net was closing, and the chase felt like someone ripping the air out of my chest as everything sped up at once. I watched texts flood my burner from him, first sharp and angry, then hollow and pleading, then apologetic like someone trying to patch a hole with tissue paper. The detectives kept piling up evidence until it became a mountain. Grainy camera frames, a gas receipt with a partial plate number, a discarded bag of restraints found behind a storage unit, and that notebook from the glove box with lists and counties and names written like a ledger. Each piece read like a page in a manual for how to take someone and make it legal to be alone. When the surveillance units drew closer, he didn't wait around. He bolted, trashing a trail that led into the woods and onto back roads he'd known since he was a kid. There was a moment where I felt stupid for caring which way he went, and a colder moment where I felt furious that he'd even thought he could run from something that had already hurt someone else. Detective Hale called it a pattern, getaway, lie, bargain. The pattern said he wasn't smart enough to hide and too desperate to stay away. They decided to pull him back into the light with a trap that needed my voice. We set up a meet, Hale told me over the phone, and he explained it like it was a plan for a spool of safety. Arrange a time, let him think it's a bargain between us. Why are you so we can listen, and surround the park with undercover officers who'd look like normal parents. My chest dropped at the word meet because anything that involved me talking to him felt like stepping on glass. But I said yes because every small delay could mean another woman in a metal room. The meeting was at a park that had a playground where kids shrieked and the swings creaked, the kind of public place that swallowed secrets into noise. They wired me up with a tiny mic, and an agent tucked a body cam behind my collar like a second skin. Hale was in the van 2 rows over, and I could hear his voice in my earpiece, calm and clipped like a metronome. They told me to act normal, to act like I might take him back or trade details for safety, to keep him talking until they had what they needed. It felt like theater and crime all at once, with me as the main prop. When he arrived, he looked like he'd been dragged through a storm. He tried charm first, sliding into the playground like he owned small moments. "Hey," he said to me, voice softer than it had any right to be, eyes flicking to the swings as if looking for an exit. "We can talk. I can fix this. Tell me what they want." I kept my face calm and my hands in my pockets because any tremor could turn the scene into chaos. I said nothing for a beat and let him talk because I needed him to keep talking. He moved to bargaining. "They made me," he said, voice quick with rehearsed blame. "They threatened me. I was stupid. I owe money. They told me they'd hurt us if I didn't help. You know the debts." His fingers tapped on the bench like a metronome of guilt and fear. I said, "Who, names, units, where?" and each question felt like prodding a wound. He tried to shift it, to paint himself as the small pawn forced by bigger players, naming people I'd never heard of and places that sounded like notes in a ledger. Then the calm cracked. He looked suddenly at me with a face that wasn't his anymore. "You don't understand," he hissed, low enough that the kids on the swings couldn't hear but loud enough that the undercover watching me tensed. "If I don't get out, she'll die. If we don't work this out, she'll die." He said it like a threat and a prayer, the line blurring into something that made my stomach flip. People nearby glanced up from their phones. A toddler dropped a popsicle and started to cry. I kept my voice level when I said, "Who holds her? Where?" Because panic would be the wrong signal now. He tried to run then, a sudden lung toward the perimeter where an undercover officer pretended to tie a shoe. It was sloppy and fast and predictable because desperation makes you predictable. Two officers tackled him before he could clear the sandbox, and for a second the world was a tangle of limbs and shouted commands. He screamed the mother's name and pulled at the cuffs as if that would make the world bend. "You have to let me go," he yelled, voice raw. "She will die if you don't do the deal." His words hit like wet cloths. Negotiators slid between threat and proof, pressing him quietly until his voice changed from loud to small. They asked again and again for the storage unit, tested the coordinates like a trap, and he finally broke. "Unit 14, he spat, and then another number, each one landing on the list of places they'd been tracing. He kept trying to bargain for leniency in the same breath he gave them the last hiding places, as if time bought him bargaining chips. The officers wrote it down, eyes hard and fast, while I felt like my insides scraped against something sharp. When they finally led him away, the playground noise rushed back in like a hand smacking a drum. Parents gathered around in stilted clusters, staring the way people stare at accidents that don't involve them. He kept yelling that the mother would die without a deal, but the negotiators had the storage unit names and the time to move. Detective Hale put a hand on my shoulder, quiet and steady, and said, "We got him, now we go get the rest." My voice was a thin reed when I asked, "Is she okay?" And Hale just shook his head and told me they had a warrant, teams en route, and a prayer I could hear in the background, "Hurry." We ran like a red line had been drawn across the map, and everywhere in between was wrong. The team moved fast, keys turned, bolt cutters bit through metal, and the storage unit door rolled up with a tired hiss. Inside it smelled like old air and metal and fear, a boxed-in world with a single chair and cords. They cut the bindings and lifted her out, and she was alive but barely, skin dry, eyes rolling like someone surfacing from too deep. Paramedics moved with calm hands, wrapped her in blankets, checked vitals, and carried her to the ambulance like she was glass. I watched them work and felt a heavy relief wash through me that was sharp and wet at the edges. They took her to the hospital, and minutes later they had Lily there beside her, and the moment they touched it was loud in my chest. Lily collapsed into her mother's arms like someone falling into a story that finally answered. The mother pressed her to her, whispering over and over, I'm here," and I think both of them were saying that to themselves more than to anyone else. Nurses fussed with IVs and monitors, and the room felt small and too clean, but the sound of a woman breathing again was a thunder in my ears. Detective Hale stood with me outside the door and said, "We found her. She's alive. That's the thing that matters." I kept rubbing my hands together like a man with nothing else to do. Sophia turned up because no one is clever enough to hide forever. They found her at a bus station 3 states away, sweat and cheap coffee on her breath, fake IDs, and a wad of cash in her bag. She tried to slip through like a ghost, but the agents moved quick and quiet. They cuffed her with the ease of people who had practiced this exact motion for hours and years. When they read her Miranda rights, she just stared like she expected it, like it was a line in a script she'd recited before. They hauled her off, and I watched, thinking about the crescent moon tattoo, and how such a small mark turns into a huge thing in a case like this. My husband didn't get to play brave. He called from a cell they couldn't trace and pleaded until his voice cracked. "I can help," he said through the slurred fear. "Tell them about others. I can make this stop." He tried to bargain and blame at once. Detective Hale explained the terms plainly: cooperate and testify, and the prosecutors would consider a reduced sentence based on the value of his information. He agreed, voice low and full of practical fear, and later in court he took the stand, naming storage units, people, and routes. The plea deal wasn't mercy. It was a tool the state used to pull apart a machine that had been running on human terror. Public exposure turned my life into a small war. Reporters dug and found the edges of the story, and then strangers felt licensed to add their judgments. I got hateful messages, angry calls at odd hours, and one voicemail that promised consequences if I didn't drop the case. My phone buzzed like a bad insect. Detective Hale told me to screenshot everything and handed me numbers for victim services. I filed for divorce in a courthouse that smelled like old coffee and new paper, and I sat in a small office, while signatures and forms turned my life into a new shape. The judge signed a temporary restraining order that froze bank accounts and legally pushed him away like a solid wall between my past and my future. I moved into a small apartment with cheap linoleum and a view of a brick wall, and that became my safe place. It was humble and full of boxes, a place I could lock and count the locks on the door like prayer beads. I worked 2 jobs to pay the rent, and my hands learned new rhythms: cashier beeps, late-night loading, small comforts bought on payday. I told myself every small thing mattered: a paid bill, a plant that survived a week, a shower that didn't have someone else's towel hanging over the rail. Detective Hale checked in sometimes with a quiet, "How are you doing?" And I said the honest answer in short pieces because honest felt like a thing you couldn't afford to waste. The mother and Lily rebuilt in small steps, not giant ones. Therapy was a prescription and a ritual. Appointments twice a week, a social worker who helped with school meetings, and a part-time security job for the mother arranged through victim services so she could start earning again without feeling exposed. Lily learned to sleep with a soft nightlight and to write her feelings in a small notebook that she colored on the margins. Months passed and they both got steadier, the mother returning to her sense of humor in small, crooked smiles, and Lily starting to trust a grown-up without testing every surface. Months later, Lily invited me to a small birthday party in a cramped living room with a lopsided cake and a pile of mismatched balloons. She came up to me at the end of it, small and solemn, and mouthed, "Thank you." She hugged me quick and quiet, and the words landed soft like a hand on a scar. I said, "You're welcome," and meant it with everything I had. It wasn't heroic or cinematic. It was a human exchange that fit in the pocket of my life like a coin. Life stitched itself back in slow seams. The case moved through courts, with Sophia getting a long sentence and my husband taking a reduced term in exchange for his testimony. The ring's other pieces were still being chased down, but each arrest closed some little loop. I kept seeing Detective Hale at the edges of things, and sometimes we shared coffee and small victories. I still sleep with one eye open sometimes and still check locks twice, but I also let myself laugh more and answer texts. The world ended badly and then quietly tried to be ordinary again. We were all scarred and wary, but we were moving forward, one small proof at a time that justice and recovery could both happen slowly and stubbornly.